Have you heard the one about the incumbent president who was so unpopular he declined to run for re-election? So instead, his vice president officially became the nominee at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. This is not a current event story, but the parallels to President Lyndon Johnson and the election of 1968 are uncanny. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. Several presidents chose not to run for a second term. Presidents James K. Polk and Rutherford B. Hayes both had promised they would only serve one term. Calvin Coolidge and Harry Truman became presidents after the death of their predecessors, won elections on their own, but chose not to run for a second elected term. But before President Joe Biden, the most recent president to decline running for a second elected term was President Lyndon Johnson. At the beginning of 1968, incumbent Johnson expected he would easily win the Democratic Party's nomination for president, and then, hopefully, defeat his Republican challenger and win re-election to another four-year term. In his first term, Johnson pushed through ambitious domestic programs, known collectively as the Great Society, which included the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the War on Poverty, Project Head Start, Medicare and Medicaid, the Cabinet-level Department of Transportation, the Water Quality Act of 1965, the Clean Air Act of 1963, the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which eventually led to the creation of NPR and PBS, the home of Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Johnson also presided over a booming economy, thanks to a large 1964 tax cut for businesses and taxpayers. Being able to pass all this legislation was a huge success for his presidency, at least according to like-minded Democrats. The Republicans believed he had done too much, too quickly, creating wieldy and expensive big government programs that trampled on individual liberties. But the Democrats also had a problem with Johnson. For all of his domestic accomplishments, Johnson involved the United States in the disastrous, deadly, and seemingly never-ending war in Vietnam, and then lied about America's military progress. On January 30th, 1968, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong guerrillas launched the Tet Offensive, aimed at toppling the U.S.-supported South Vietnamese regime. The Tet Offensive failed in its goals. They did not overthrow the government in Saigon, and it did not cause uprisings throughout South Vietnam. However, it did succeed in one area. It burst the illusion Johnson projected to the American people that the U.S. was making progress toward a successful conclusion to the war. After the Tet Offensive, public support eroded quickly. A poll at the time revealed that a whopping 49% believed the United States should have never intervened in Vietnam in the first place. The nation was so divided over Vietnam that it was no longer possible for the president or many of his cabinet members to travel without the danger of a rowdy demonstration. Even before the Tet Offensive, some in Johnson's party were against the Vietnam War. Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota was so against the war that he challenged the sitting president for the Democratic presidential nomination. By the time of the campaign's first primary in New Hampshire on March 12th, Johnson's public approval rating had dropped to 36%, opening the door for McCarthy. Johnson survived, but barely. Johnson received 48% of the vote to McCarthy's 42%. Johnson was shown to be vulnerable. 4 days later, on March 16th, longtime Johnson nemesis Senator Robert Kennedy of New York, brother of President John Kennedy, declared he would also challenge Johnson for the nomination. Johnson's popularity was so low that a last-minute poll before the Wisconsin primary, which was next on the calendar, gave Johnson an embarrassing, humiliating 12% of the vote. The idea of retiring after one elected term was something Johnson had contemplated soon after winning the 1964 election. At the time, his concern was around his health. Men in his family died young. In 1955, when he was 46 years old, Johnson suffered a heart attack that nearly killed him. His wife, Lady Bird, was on board with retirement, but she didn't pressure Lyndon. However, she would poke him every once in a while. During a visit to see retired Congressman Carl Vinson, who had returned to Georgia after 50 years in the House, Lady Bird said, "See, Lyndon, there's a man who can leave Washington and be happy." In the spring of 1967, Johnson mentioned to his friend of 30 years, Texas Governor John Connally, that he might not run again. He also shared the thought with his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in August. By October, he had written his first draft of a withdrawal statement. In mid-January 1968, the president asked a couple of his trusted White House advisors to polish his withdrawal statement for use in his 1968 State of the Union speech. Obviously, Johnson did not drop in the statement. Johnson later said, "It just didn't fit. I couldn't go in there and lay out a big program and then say, okay, here's all this work to do, and by the way, so long, I'm leaving." On March 31st, 2 weeks after barely winning the New Hampshire primary, Johnson planned to address a nationwide television audience to announce a major shift in U.S. policy in Vietnam. He would end all bombing raids against North Vietnam and call for formal peace talks. For peace negotiations to be taken seriously, they could not be seen as political. Johnson again revisited his decision to withdraw from the election and asked for a new draft focusing on national unity to drop into the end of the speech. On the day of the speech, Johnson visited his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to show him the two alternate endings to the speech and that he was seriously considering the option where he dropped out of the race. Humphrey told him, "I can understand your reasoning, but I wish you wouldn't do it." Johnson discussed his reelection thoughts with his family, but no other aides knew of Johnson's plans. Johnson's staff was still actively planning his campaign strategy and still believed Johnson would win renomination on the convention's first ballot. When Johnson sat down to deliver the address, even he was not sure he would read the words that his team had crafted. It was not included in the advance text of his speech. 1 hour before he went before the television cameras, he ordered a U.S. Army Signal Corpsman to add the text to the teleprompters. When Deputy Press Secretary Bob Fleming, who was in charge of proofreading the text in the teleprompter, read the end of the speech, he literally dropped his pipe right out of his mouth and onto the floor. Even then, Johnson said, "I'm not going to know probably until I get there whether I'm going to use that speech." It was only in the closing minutes of the speech, when Johnson raised his hand to his forehead and read the words,
"Of those to whom much is given, much is asked,"
that Lady Bird knew Lyndon would read the statement. What followed stunned the nationwide audience with the unexpected declaration,
"I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president."
Even those who had an inkling were surprised. Governor Connally said, "I'm stunned. I didn't think it would happen." That night, Johnson was noticeably happier than people had seen him in a long time. He did not read his briefing books, and he slept in the next morning. The pressure had been released. The two primary candidates already in the race and their respective staffs were shocked, giddy, and confused. They were unsure what this could mean for the Democrats' chances in '68. Robert Kennedy was at a loss for words. "I don't quite know what to say," he stammered. McCarthy gave credit for Johnson's decision to his anti-war supporters. "I don't think they could stand up against 5 million college kids just shouting for peace. There was too much willpower there." In college campuses across the country, students honked their car horns and held spontaneous street parties. Perhaps now the war would end without Johnson at the helm. As the anti-war activists rejoiced, Democratic leaders struggled to respond, while also worrying about how the decision may sap energy and political attention away from the campaign. The public and news media praised Johnson's decision not to run again. Most of the record 20,000 letters and telegrams sent to the White House after Johnson's announcement congratulated him for his generous decision. There was a belief that a new generation could offer hope and bridge the political divide in the country. It was also a sign that the political system was still responsive to the will of the people. Johnson's poll numbers jumped from 57% disapproval to 57% approval as a result of his decision. Early in his presidency, Johnson declared, "I want to do only one thing in this job. I want to unite this country." By not running again, he was starting down that path. Unfortunately, the hope of national reunification was short-lived. 5 days later, on April 4th, 1968, James Earl Ray assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. as he stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. As Johnson was watching the heartbreaking coverage, he told an aide, "Everything we've gained in the last few days, we're going to lose tonight." Riots broke out in more than 100 American cities. Less than a month after Johnson's decision was announced, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, announced his own bid for the nomination. Even though he was viewed as the heir apparent to the Johnson legacy, Johnson himself proclaimed neutrality. This further divided the party. The campaign was again turned on its head when on June 5th, Sirhan Sirhan shot and killed Senator Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles following his California primary victory speech. At the time of Kennedy's assassination, Humphrey had the delegate lead over Kennedy and McCarthy for the nomination, but he did not have a majority. However, after a bitter campaign, not all of Kennedy's anti-war supporters could get behind McCarthy to defeat Humphrey. Kennedy's delegates split between McCarthy and a late entry to the contest, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. In late August of 1968, the Democratic delegates, along with anti-war protesters, gathered in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. By the time of the convention, with the help of party insiders, which we now know as superdelegates, Humphrey had secured enough delegates to make his nomination uneventful. But outside the convention, the anti-war protesters were angry that the plank for peace was defeated, meaning the Democrats were going to run a campaign to continue the war in Vietnam. While thousands protested, television cameras captured their clash with the Chicago police who used billy clubs and tear gas to gain control. The scene of bloodied and sometimes unconscious protesters, juxtaposed with the political nominating process, shocked those watching at home. Over the last 5 months of Johnson's term, more U.S. soldiers died, while the peace talks in Paris stalled. One of the reasons for the failure of the peace talks was that the campaign of Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon was telling the South Vietnamese president that they would get better terms with the next administration. Johnson learned of this through wiretaps, intercepts, and surveillance, but it was not enough admissible evidence to prove treason. During the campaign, Humphrey started to drift away from Johnson's position on Vietnam, but it was too little, too late. Nixon hammered on the violence and division within the country to show that Johnson's policies were destructive for the country. Nixon promised to be the law and order president to bring back peace and stability. Nixon defeated Humphrey that November. Johnson did suffer a fatal heart attack on January 22, 1973, 2 days after the end of what would have been his second elected term in office.
Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.